Okay, everybody, welcome back. We're about to dive into chapter 4 of Chittick's book, and the title of the chapter is Beyond Ideology. Okay, so let's see. He starts out with a definition of ideology. Quote, any sort of socio-political program built on analysis of human nature that are deemed to be rational and scientific. Okay, this includes political religion. Professor Chittick states 3 ways that the intellectual tradition can help us navigate the world of ubiquitous ideologies. Okay, so he says that the world is filled with ideologies, which are basically systems of thought that are driven by a agenda. So traditional Islam and traditional religion can break the shell of dogmatism, assert the absoluteness of the real, which is God, and it can revive the internal level of mythical imagination. Now, transmitted knowledge is the type of knowledge that dominates human culture, and modern culture is no exception. When we imagine that we know something, most often we have heard it from others. Nor can we claim our own personal and experiential knowledge qualifies as intellectual because we've received it from the sense organs, which are notoriously unreliable. And we have interpreted the experience of the sense organs in terms of the prevailing worldview. So transmitted knowledge is our ordinary, everyday sort of knowledge. Intellectual knowledge is something quite different. Knowledge only qualifies as intellectual when the knowers know it at the very root of their own intelligence, without any intermediary, not even imagination or cogitation. Okay, it's just something that you have an instinct for. It comes from a deep sense of intuition. So how may traditional intellectual knowledge break the shell of dogmatism? Dogmatism is a claim put forth by teachers or thinkers or ideologues that everybody must adhere to a certain set of beliefs and practices as transmitted from their own trusted sources and interpreted by themselves. So experts present a worldview and expect you to take it based on their claims of being experts. Okay. In modern society, dogmatism is found among believers of every sort of God. So there's religious dogmatism, scientific dogmatism, dogmatism about democracy, socialism, progress, freedom, development, and so on. So dogmatism is a closed statement of facts that puts an end to further thought, ending the quest to achieve intellectual understanding. It induces a passive mental attitude and acquiescence and acceptance. Modern people think that we should accept the given popular consensus about the nature of the world that has been established by scientists and scholars and the media, because we, after all, lack expertise. The intellectual tradition, on the other hand, demands first-hand understanding of the cosmos as it is founded in God. Ideology, in contrast, is built on the imitation of beliefs established by the fathers of modern thought, the prophets of modernity. These prophets, in turn, base their claims on the authority of the scientific worldview established by the Enlightenment. From beginning to end, ideology demands belief in the authority of transmitted knowledge, not in truth that we have come to know for ourselves. The second goal of the Islamic intellectual tradition is to assert the absoluteness of God. This presumes that the individual is capable of perceiving and knowing God directly. Chittick says it this way: human intelligence is adequate to perceive the real. This attitude allows the seeker to be unrestrained by any dogmatic closure, so there's nothing standing between the individual and the divine. Not any, dogmatic wall. But this reality of our actual personal connection with the divine doesn't negate the necessity of transmitted knowledge, okay, such as primary truths. Okay, so the primary truths unlock our ability to understand what we are perceiving from God directly. He's going to tell us about what he calls the mythic imagination. Okay. Modern scholarship has gone a long way towards rediscovering the role of myth and symbol in pre-modern civilizations and cultures. But modernity in general lacks the resources for understanding the real significance of what is going on. The reason of this is simply that it has failed to come up with a proper metaphysics, cosmology, and spiritual anthropology. By proper, I mean dealing with the inherent truth of things, not simply with a thing as it is described in transmitted learning of an ideological and scientific age. Contemporary academic sciences have in fact been constrained by the dogmatism of transmitted sciences such as physics, biology, psychology, and sociology, and as a result, theorists have placed arbitrary limits on human possibilities. So the Islamic term haqq, H-A-Q-Q, means the essential ontological truth of a thing, and it is reference to its connection to the ultimate reality, its transcendent element. So every thing that we perceive in the cosmos has a connection to the divine, okay, and there's an essential element of truth within it. For instance, scripture is composed symbolically, and it plays a highly significant role in the development of consciousness. However, because much of the impact of scripture is largely on the transcendent level of our mind, above the reasoning level, it is largely dismissed by modern thinkers. Okay, so now the third goal of the Islamic intellectual tradition is to recognize the proper role of myth, which is symbolic, in the human understanding, and if necessary, to revitalize discussion of the mythic. The Enlightenment succeeded in establishing the supremacy of instrumental rationality by rejecting the cognitive significance of myth and symbol, which are characteristic of scripture and much of religious discourse. So the Age of Enlightenment, they largely dismissed scripture as primitive and nonsense. Basically, they're saying, it's a bunch of fairy tales. And when they did that, they then cleared the way to establish their own authority. Okay, the authority based on the ideology of the supremacy of science. So they dismissed the invisible realm, which was the basis of traditional philosophical thought. So God, angels, life after death, human perfection, these were all categorized as meaningless because they could not be addressed by empirical methodologies of instrumental reason. So the very cognitive impact of myth and symbol is dismissed by science, whereas Sufis, and to a lesser degree the Islamic philosophers, looked upon the signs and symbols of the Quran as a means to open up the soul to the presence of the real in all things. Instrumental rationality, which is thought that is based on ideology, is reason which is formed by certain foundational concepts which shape the process into a direction that predetermines its outcome. Reason thereby becomes an instrument of an agenda. By dismissing transcendent myth and symbol, modernism removes resistance to the ideology of its worldview. Okay? So the real danger of ideological rationality lies in the dogmatic and absolutizing claims made by its supporters. Instrumental rationality must play a role in any society, to be sure, but when it plays the dominant role, the traditional teachings about human nature are necessarily obscured. And in the extreme case of the modern West, scientific knowledge itself has usurped the role of myth and symbol. This helps explain why scientism pervades the modern imagination, so much so that most people, religious people included, simply take the assumptions of science for granted. Scientism is a rationalizing ideology that has all the persuasive power of technology, education, and the media to back it up. It provides the de facto theology of the civil religion of society. So science has become the predominant religion of contemporary society. Many contemporary thinkers who criticize it have no effect on the thinking and preaching of our own homegrown theologians and jurists, the scientists, technocrats, and journalists who have long established a new set of myths and symbols to drive the modern world. Okay, so picking it back up on page 70 where Chittick presents a quote from Arabi talking about how myth and reason might be viewed together in harmony. This is what the quote says. Arabi maintains that we must see myth and reason as coexisting in harmony. The real, which is God, necessarily appears dichotomously to contingent beings. God is both creator and destroyer, both merciful and wrathful. Any analysis of the divine attributes shows that they must be understood both positively and negatively, both in terms of transcendence and in terms of eminence. The reason for this is that simply in itself, God is both absent from and present with everything in the universe. Okay, so this is a tricky spot, ontologically speaking, meaning where we're trying to grasp how God is present, omnipresent. Okay? So it is stated that the divine must be considered both in terms of transcendence and eminence, so that God is above and outside of creation and yet intimately present in creation at the same time. Okay? And if we Arabi says that if we put excessive stress on rational thought, which is thought that is based in the mythical or higher intuitive level, then God becomes, transcendent to a degree that we don't have a true connection. Okay? But if we depend instead on reason that is based in our external perceptions, then we end up with agnosticism and atheism. So to counterbalance the I, we have the symbol. Okay? And we perceive the meaning of the symbolic with our heart. So through the willingness to validate our inner perceptions and our intuitions, we can then come to actually perceive the truth within external things. So we then arrive at the conviction that everything that is apparent or literal or external corresponds to something hidden, spiritual or internal. Okay, and this is the sort of thinking that we have the doorway to participate in through sacred scripture and esoteric interpretation of sacred scripture. Arabi tells us that the heart, which is realized intelligence, reason joined to the spiritual imagination and mythical vision, that this is the sacred core of human selfhood. And so it is our task to see everything that we perceive in the external world as a symbol of God. Okay? The realized intelligence must keep the symbolic significance of things alive and respond properly to the living presence of God in the world. Only this attitude can allow people to respect the rights not only of God and other human beings, but also the natural realm. When people fail to see the divine face wherever they look, they either fall into a one-sided transcendentalism that is characteristic of religious fundamentalism, or they fall into atheism and agnosticism, which is characteristic of the secular scientific fundamentalism. Okay. Next section is given the subheading of self-understanding, begins on page 73. So this section is absolutely important, and it is succinctly and beautifully written, and so I'm going to present just a long quote starting on page 73. If the Islamic intellectual tradition has any help to offer the modern predicament, it seems to me that it lies in the call to recover ourselves, each of us individually, a proper understanding of our own nature. Otherwise, dogmatism and ideology cannot be avoided. The fundamental insight of the tradition is that in order to know the proper way of acting in the world and living out our human embodiment, we must know what the world signifies to us. We must know our own nature, and we must know the self that knows. The point that is typically forgotten in discussions of who we are is that we cannot know the self as an object, only as a subject. We cannot know ourselves except when subject and object are indistinguishable. The unity of the knower and the known, the self and the world, of man and God, is the ultimate insight of Tawhid. It is this alone that gives human beings the ability to see things as they truly are, to recognize the truth of God, people, and things, and to act properly in response to the rights of God and the rights of man. Offering a critique of dogmatism and ideology is necessarily the first step if we are to recover a proper understanding of human nature. But proper understanding demands recognizing that the human self is grounded in trans-historical intelligence and ultimately in absolute reality. As long as scientists and scholars persist in ignoring the fact that the soul cannot know the truth of things by standing on someone else's shoulders, there will be no escape from dogmatism, which is grounded in imitation and turns transmitted information into absolutes. Until it is recognized that the only dependable and real knowledge is awareness of the first reality, or God, there will be no escape from the ever more polarized world of ideological conflict. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 4. And so there we'll pause, and there was a lot in there. You probably have to listen to it twice in order to really grasp it. You know, I definitely find that a printed version is much more helpful when I'm trying to really get a hold of an idea, because I can just read and reread, and the printed word allows me to process very deliberately. So encourage you to, look at my PDF where, those long quotes are to be found, or get the book. I mean, this book is something that I will, I'm sure, reread more than once. So there you go. That's the end of chapter 4. And I hope you'll tune in for chapter 5. The book is a total of 7 chapters. So we've got 3 more chapters to go. We're about to pick it up on page 75, so that is essentially halfway through the book. All right, there you go. And so I hope that was good. See you next episode.